This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Trisa, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am Trisa Marie Edmonson. I am the daughter to William Ward Edmonson Jr. And Donna Marie Edmonson. I'm a sister, a stepmother to 2 adult children, and a wife.
Who are you?
I'm the mother to Kamari William Bomia, an absolutely amazing and very loving little 2.5-year-old boy.
Who are you?
I'm a Black woman born and raised in the Bay Area, which I am forever connected to.
Who are you?
I'm a lover of all things nature, water, and spring and summertime.
Who are you?
I am a teacher by trade and an educator in my heart, and a nurturer at my core.
Who are you?
I'm a prison and police abolitionist who believes that we as a society and community have much, much, much better ways that we can develop to address our problems and heal.
And finally, for now, who are you?
I'm forever connected to my spirits and my Egun who walked before me and continue to walk with me.
Thank you so much, Trisa. We're going to get into all the intersections of those things and more in just a moment.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Trisa Edmonson to the podcast. Trisa is an educator, artist, advocate, and change maker from the Bay Area. Her background is largely focused on young adults with carceral involvement. We are so excited to have her on the podcast today, and so without further ado, let's get back into it.
Thank you again, Trisa, so much for being here. It's always good to check in. So to the full extent that you want to answer the question in this moment, how are you?
I am all right. Yeah, I'm kind of in a non-nuanced space of mediocrity right now. Not great and not horrible.
Beautiful. That's a space that is better than horrible, and I can definitely appreciate that. I was so excited to have this conversation, and this isn't the first time you and I have talked, which is the same, which sometimes happens with some of our guests. But as I first got to know you, and then did the whole LinkedIn, oh, what has she done? Where is she? How did she get to this place where she is at the ACLU, which, we haven't quite mentioned yet. I was like, oh, dang, she's done this work across all of the sectors, in all the ways that so many people who have come on these airwaves have talked about within the schooling system, within the criminal legal system. And I'm curious, you've been doing restorative justice work, quote unquote, restorative justice work for a long time. But you were probably even doing the work before you knew the words. So in your own words, how did this get started for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was kind of thinking about this conversation today, I did reflect a little bit on this. And I think what my first kind of experience in holding these conversations and leveraging relationship to kind of get into the really difficult things about how our identities connect and also like rub against each other, like that kind of wounds, touching wounds, like experience, was when I was in, I want to say college. I have no idea what year it was, but I somehow, and I don't even know how I got this connection, but somehow someone invited me to be a kind of like a counselor at these weekend retreats in Santa Cruz, California, called Camp Anytown. And I don't even know if they're still working or not, but I used to get like a check for $250 to go spend 3 days in the woods with a bunch of high school kids and talk about race and gender and sexual orientation. And there were a whole bunch of really problematic kind of trust building activities that I think they did a lot of like using the bodies of impacted people to teach not impacted people about the harm that they cause, which I don't really ascribe to at all anymore. But they would have these massive conversations at the end. And I always found myself at the center of trying to create these bridges between the folks that were struggling because they were sharing the ways, like, and these are children, these are high school kids, like the ways that they're, experiencing their identities in school, and the way that people that have positions of power and privilege are kind of sitting with this, like, wait a second, I hurt you. I don't understand how I hurt you. Right. What does this mean about me? And does this make me a bad person? Like, and I was really kind of leaning into those conversations. So I'd say that was probably like the first experience that I had doing like what would later be perceived as restorative justice or transformative justice work. Um, and yeah, and then I would say that the first, like from there, it just transitioned into working in educational settings with young people that are justice impacted. And yeah, that began in, I had a job in Newark. It was like my first teaching job. And I'm working with all of these like 16 to 24-year-old kids. I'd say 70% of them had some type of contact with the carceral system. And yeah, they're just traditional mechanisms of addressing their behavior weren't effective. Because if they were, they'd still have been in school, and they weren't. They were coming to my program, which was not traditional school. And yeah, and so like just the ways that schools dealt with things didn't work with them. So we had to figure out all kinds of methods, and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of conversations, lots of learning, like teachable moments. And yeah, I don't even know if restorative justice was a like language that was in education at that point. That was more than 20 years ago.
Yeah. Ooh, wow. When I think about doing this work, and you talked about like what stood out to me is like I don't even know how like someone identified me as this person who is like, oh, you should be a counselor in this space. I, I know that like there was something about you that people were able to identify as like, oh, Trisa would be like a really good keeper of space for these young people, addressing these ideas, wrestling with these ideas. I'm wondering who held that kind of space for you growing up, where you knew that like, oh, this is a way that I can be with people.
I did a lot of youth programming in high school that wasn't at my school because I was, I'm Black. I went to a very, very white school in Livermore, California, which is, it was great, like experience and whatnot, but it was not comfortable for me. And there were a couple of teachers I think that tried, but in retrospect, like I didn't have a Black teacher until I got into college, which I think is the experience of a lot of people of color. But there really was never a teacher that could kind of resonate with my experience of what it is to be the only person in a space. And so when I did get into when I in high school, I did a lot of like programs outside. And so I remember Pete Perry was the executive director of the YMCA Youth and Government program in California in the 90s, and he was Black. And um, there were just times where it's like he knew how to hold that space for me. And And it was a lot of like side conversations of like, hey, I know that you're experiencing this right now. I know this is difficult for you, right? I know that like I like there is an elephant in this room. We are not ignoring this. We know that this is here. Um, and then also kind of being that bridge for me and helping me to engage in those conversations with my peers when it would get to a place that was hard. And in that space, like those peers and I were really close. And so those conversations were really painful. But there was also so much opportunity for growth, right? um because it gets back to that James Baldwin quote that I always get wrong, that like you like about the right to exist, and so it's like there's some things that we can talk about, but like whether or not I have a right to exist is not one of them.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so like when those conversations my with my friends, like, and people, then these are the only people from that time in my life that I still communicate with and I'm still friends with. And when sometimes those conversations would kind of get to that point where it's like, okay, wait a second, you're beginning to, this isn't so much now about like politics anymore, right? Now you're talking about me, right? Now you're talking about my right to be a person, right? This isn't a free speech conversation. This is an existence conversation, right? It was like Pete, I felt, helped me build the skills to explain myself, but also it, as the adult in that space, helped to create that bridge so that we weren't destroying each other in the process of that conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There is this. I I want to call back for our listeners to the conversation that we had with Stas and Leah a little bit ago about like the differences between, um, you know, disagreement, conflict, harm, hurt, and abuse, right? And like we can disagree. Just to go back to that James Baldwin quote, which I'm not remembering perfectly either, but like we can disagree about a lot of things, and disagreement is fine. We can be in conflict about um, different things where we're both trying to get different needs met. But when somebody is using their position of power, privilege in a certain space to belittle someone, right, or deny the existence of someone, or like threaten someone's existence, like that's where there is harm, there's hurt, there's abuse, and we want to make sure that we're one limiting that as much as possible, but like that's where these practices of restoration and transformation of conflict and harm come in, and to have that modeled and that space held for you by a caring adult, it is a really beautiful thing, because like not everybody gets that for sure. And I'm curious what that looked like for you as you like went into the professional world, right? You talked about doing this in that summer camp space, but you talked about, when you have these students who are bordering adulthood, having encountered the criminal legal system, which, let's be honest, is not very open to like, this is who you are as a person, and I understand the harm that you've got. What was it like for you working in those spaces, even without knowing the words or like framing of quote unquote restorative justice?
So there were kind of two places where I would start to build those skills, and kind of hold space for those conversations. And so the first is kind of addressing typical young people behavior that's exaggerated, right? Because of the experiences that these young people have had. Like these are folks that they were never normalized into public education. Public education for a lot of them was like really traumatizing. I had a young person that was 19 that came into my program and did not know how to read. And he had an IEP, and I asked him, do you know what your diagnosis is? Like, what do you have this IEP for? He said, I don't know. I have a learning disability. I just can't read. Like nobody had ever explained to him. And then sitting down with him, I'm not a special education teacher. I was able to like give him a like an online quiz. And it was so clear of like the 22 questions of you may be dyslexic. He answered like 19 of them correctly. right? But no one had a conversation with this child about dyslexia. No one had told him you are dyslexic. No one had taught him to decode, right? For folks that aren't educators, when a child's like identified as being dyslexic, there are skills that you can teach them before the age of like 6 or 7, where it substantially decreases the amount of effort they have to put into reading as an adult. And if that's not identified, there's still additional skills and methods that can support dyslexic people in being able to use the written word in a way that's like, effective and whatnot. So so that's just an example of this one particular child. And he had all types of stuff happening in his life. And so, there were lots of things he would do. Like he would put his head down in the classroom. He'd put his hoodie on. There was so much conversation about wearing hats in class. Like, are the kids, are they allowed to wear hats? Are they not allowed to wear hats? So those conversations that we spend way too much time in education having rather than like actual learning. So part of that restorative work was, how do I create a space where there is enough norms that these young people are able to actually engage in this process of learning at multiple different educational levels, right? Because we're talking about kids that cannot read to kids that were pretty much basically ready for college. So how can I create a space and enough norms to allow them to be able to like actually learn? Because there has to be some kind of decorum. And when they step out of that decorum, what am I going to do to help bring them back in? And so those kinds of conversations, but also a lot of it too is just eliminating unnecessary barriers. Because in education, restorative justice should be, it's not in most cases, but it should be about eliminating unnecessary barriers. What is the necessity of making a child take off his hat? Tell me the purpose of that, right? There is no necessity for that. And so exploring these kind of conversations about why do we have these rules? But then also,
how did those conversations go?
In my classroom, kids are allowed to wear hats. I've had multiple arguments with multiple other teachers about the rules that I allow, the things I allow kids to do in my class. And then they go into the other class and they're not allowed to do those things. And I'm like, it's context, and context is important. And it's a skill. And we're not talking about 7-year-olds. We're talking about young adults. And so they should be able to understand that all rules apply in all places. I'm not offended by hats. They don't bother me. So kids in my class are allowed to wear them. And typically I found that teachers in my setting, the teachers that don't want the hats are the ones that are doing workforce stuff, and so they want the kids to take their hats off because they're working on resumes and they're working on interviewing. That makes sense. Again, it's context, but these conversations a lot of times are about context, and schools don't like, they like rigid things that always apply and are always uniform. And it can be frustrating. But then the second space is the conversations between young people when conflict would arise. And I think that's where we really hit a sweet spot, is like, and it's not just conflicts between each other. A lot of times it was conflicts that was happening with them when they would go back to their communities, right? The school location was in the Ironbound section of Newark, which is basically like, Newark is, 75, 80% Black, and the Ironbound is like 20 or 30% Black, and all of the Black people in the Ironbound live in the projects. So that community is mostly Brazilian and Portuguese. And there's a history of some antagonism towards Black people in that community. And so the kids would come back and they would tell me these stories about folks being aggressive with them in the park, or going into stores and not being able to be served and whatnot. And so a lot of it was conversations on how to navigate that. Sometimes they were things that we were able to support them with, and sometimes they were things that had passed and we couldn't. But also, kind of ad hoc retaliation prevention was a lot, like building the trust so that young people would come to, not just me, because I was a teacher, but we had case managers as well, like building the support and the relationship that when young people experience something they wanted to retaliate for, or experience something in their community, that they would come and they would talk to us before they did something, which gives us a leverage. It gives us a space to be able to be like, okay, wait, you didn't just respond to that, which means you are thinking about it. So let's think about this some more. right? And that, to me, I'm not, I was not skilled then in that. That was not what I was supposed to be doing. But when you're a teacher and you're building a relationship with young people that are gang affiliated, it just, it comes up, it happens. So yeah, I would say all of those conversations and just the way that the classroom was structured, centering it around them, I think was really important. I feel like I'm all over the map in answering this question. I'm sorry.
No, no, that's beautiful. I Everyday happenings are, I think, what often get lost in the theoretical frameworks of this is how you create community agreements. This is how you have a restorative conversation. And like the application is what people often have a difficult time conceptualizing, or they're faced with a situation where it's like, oh, this wasn't in the training, right? But how do we apply these principles in when you're talking about, meeting people where they're at? Even if you are not like skilled as a violence interrupter, right? You know, taking the principles that you know about holding space and being responsive to people's needs, helping people understand the impact of certain actions like that specifically talking about retaliation would have, like see risking the safety of yourself, others in your community, right? Those are those are very crucial skills, and so thank you for taking that meandering path across like the different ways that applied. You didn't stay in that space for long, but you continued to do similar work with young people who were encountering the criminal legal system with CCI, the Center for Court Innovation. What did that look like?
CCI is such an amazing organization, and they're doing so much just phenomenal work. Um, so I came to CCI, I don't know, like 2015, I think, uh, charged with developing their education program. And so, same kind of problem or issue where it's like you have the most difficult to reach, the most disengaged, the most disenfranchised young people, the people that most programs are like, I'm not sure that we're able to serve this person, right? In this one space called the Justice Corps, which is a state, I'm sorry, a citywide program in New York, for, I want to say 5 years, 6 years. And so I came in and was kind of charged with like, we have all these young people, we send them to GED programs and alternative education programs, and they're not successful. And they still need an education. So what are we going to do? And so I was kind of hired to build out in like an education program that was in house. And yeah, and then from there, I ended up just building really amazing relationships with the young people in that role. And it at the time that I was there, like I was working with the Justice Court, but there's also was like the Harlem Reentry Court, which was basically like a parole program where folks coming back would check in with the judge, and their case manager would be on site and the substance abuse folks would be on site. And it was this kind of program to support people coming back on parole and getting back into society. And so we got a lot of young people from there. So this program ended up, the Justice Corps, our age group tended to be like above, like in the older 20s, like 22, 23, 24. Yeah, the Justice Corps was just a completely, I don't know that another program like it has existed, or in existence now, just because like when I came in initially, we were really well funded and we were able to do the things that the kids needed. And we really had, like, despite the fact that the program was like it was overseen really stringently from the funder, they gave us a lot of leeway. Yeah, like the term that my one of my supervisors used to use, and I think probably just applies to the entire spirit of the program, was relentless engagement. And
Mm-hmm.
so, short of like assaulting someone, there's nothing that was going to get a child kicked out from that program. there was nothing. And if a young person tried that program at and they got 2 months into it and it didn't work, they got locked up again. They, lost their housing. They decided that the streets were more interesting and didn't want to come. Whatever reason, the next cycle, they were welcome to come back. We had young people do the program 3 times. And I don't I don't have access to the data of like where they are now. Um, but I definitely know that a lot of young people got opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise. Um, and again, it was the same kind of situation of just how do we create spaces so that young people have different options and different opportunities. Like there was because I was there for 2 years and then I left for a bit for another program and the funding for that was discontinued, and then I returned and I managed the same program until the funding for that program was discontinued. But when I came back as the director, we had a young person that had graduated from the program. He'd gotten his GED with us. And it was a hot summer, like just temperature wise hot. And then there was just a lot of stuff happening in the development that he lived where he didn't want to be there. And he would come every day and just hang out. Like, and he had his own chair. He had his own little like computer set up in the back. You'd go back there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and he's completely asleep, like in the rolling chair. And he would just come and hang out in the office with us every day. He'd be there when there weren't students there. He would be there when like we'd be in the staff meeting and he'd come and knock on the door and be like, hey, can you let me in? Right. And like we would let him into the office so that he could go and he would just chill. And every time we talked to him about it, like half the time he was working on work stuff. The other half of the time he really was just, on Facebook and whatever. But we're like, hey, what's going on? Why are you here? And he's like, if I'm out doing what my friends are doing right now, I'm going to go to jail and I don't want to do that. And so it is better for me to be here. And we created this space that allowed for young people to do just that. And within that space, we had to have a lot of conversations. Yeah, it was a beautiful program. And I honestly thought I was going to do that work for the rest of my life. And then I didn't.
I like the why is the question that's present. So I'm going to go with that and then circle back to something else that you mentioned.
So there's a logistical reality that like the funding for my position was cut and there wasn't another opportunity for me in the organization, even though they really tried. I got to give them credit. They were really trying to find me another place and there just wasn't. It's that like mid-management issue where there's only so many positions. And so I ended up going somewhere else that I didn't like. And yeah, and then as I tried to go back, about 2.5 years later, I was a mother with a toddler and I realized I don't want to get calls at 3 o'clock in the morning from young people that are in crisis, and that there's other folks that I think are better equipped to manage that now than I would be. It's not to say that I won't go back to it at some point, but yeah. And then also youth development and education is really, 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 really underpaid. And I'm just going to name that. Yeah, like offensively underpaid. And I didn't realize how underpaid folks were until I started doing other things.
That's totally justifiable. What I'm reflecting on from that experience as well, like that idea of relentless engagement, where, a lot of times people think about restorative justice, and this work generally is like, hey, we set up this program, you do these steps 1, 2, 3, and everything is solved like that, right? It's like funders ask for that, like people who support this work, people who want to try to practice, like, oh, this is great. We can build these alternatives. Like, it's not a linear path. Um, what were conversations like, asking people to, um, accept people back into the program, even after harm or, discontinuation for some other reasons?
So this kid was he was one of the younger members. I think he had just barely turned 18. And he was coming back to New York from the South, and was essentially like he was homeless. Basically, he was undomiciled, and his family in the South had dropped him off at like an aunt's house or something like that, saying he was going to get connected with his father in Harlem, and they were like, yeah, no, I don't want this kid. And there's a lot of stuff around this. He had some behavioral. I'm going to use this word. I hate this word, but he had some like behavioral disabilities. And so whatever you call it, mental health, trauma, PTSD, whatever it is that you call it, he would do some stuff that was a lot. And yeah, like it was just constant. It was constant difficulties, constant conversations. He caused a lot of strife in the organization, in my internal staff. But the thing that kept him engaged in the program was that all of the staff bought into him needing to be there. And all of the staff bought into him needing to be there. So there's like 5 staff people, and he would kind of go through each of us and who he would piss off. And so he always ended up with at least 3 allies. You know what I'm saying? So it was like that principle that we don't throw children away was understood, and it was held by all of our core staff. And so even if our administration and even if my supervisor didn't necessarily agree, right, which sometimes he didn't, there was at least 3 people advocating for him constantly. What was helpful with this kid is that he'd have like an outburst, and then he would go home and he'd think about it, and he would call everybody and apologize, and tell everybody, I'm never going to do this again. I'm so sorry. I can't believe that I acted that way. So that helped with him. But just thinking back on like the other situations of, um, especially with the graduates, because we had so many graduates that would just come and kick it, and they just pop in. And sometimes it was necessary to kind of establish guardrails, to make sure that there wasn't, and like tell folks, hey, we love that you're here. This isn't a really good time. We're going to have to ask you to come back after orientation. Sometimes we would have to establish guardrails. But that core idea that the Justice Corps is a safe space, that we don't throw children away, that even if a child is 24, 25, they're still a child, right? I'm really big on this, that yeah, they're young people, yeah, they're young adults. Most of my staff are men, or most of my kids were men, right, or boys, or whatever word it is that we want to use. They're masculine, like cis het men, the grand majority. And even if they are men, they're still kids. Like nobody treated these people, these folks, like kids, like their entire life. And so yeah, we don't throw them away, and there's always a space for them to come back. And sometimes the conversation is less about like, are we going to let this child back in, and more of, what are we going to do to get this child to come back in, because this was the space for them, right? And yeah, it was just making sure that it was understood that that was the foundation of the program. And I don't know if we were just really lucky with the people that we found that that kind of agreed. And so the conversations were never, well, I'm not sure if we want to welcome them back. that was never the conversation.
Yeah. One of the things that stood out is, you talked about like you had at least three people who were, advocating for them, which implies that there were others in any given moment who were like, I can't do this right now.
Mm-hmm.
I can't, right? Like we don't throw kids away, right? But you as an individual are not in charge of like their well-being and everything about their life being like on you, right? Like we do this work in community, and I'm reflective of how sometimes in organizations and school settings, this work gets thrown on one person. Like, be
Mm-hmm.
restorative, be the case manager, be the you know, the superhero that fixes all the problem kids, right? And that's not at all what this work is. This takes community on such a great level. I'm curious, like, I'm going to reframe this question, and in some ways I'm asking the same question, but like, what were the internal conversations around like we don't throw kids away? Like, how did you build that culture?
It's difficult. Like, and I'm trying to compare because I didn't have this culture when I was working in Jersey City. In Jersey City, I was regularly having this conversation of like, well, we're not the right space for them. I don't think that there's anything that we can do for them. Um, this one child is bringing down the entire program, right? Other people are doing what they're doing. They think that they can get away with it. And like just not an adaptive sense of how could we make this work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of it is just general orientation, but preparing the culture. um, I'm gonna be honest, part of it is resources, right? It's a lot easier to focus in and support that one kid that's really struggling, when you have 10 than it is when you have 25.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a case manager or a life coach or social worker and you've got a caseload of 50 kids, right? It's much easier to say, hey, I can't give resources to these three that they need because they're taking up my entire caseload. And I'm not able to get those kids that need my service but aren't as loud. I'm not able to assist them the way that I should. Right. Um, so it is definitely, I think the resources piece is really, really important. Um, I think also that making sure that there's opportunities for every person on the team to build relationship, right? Because if you've got a staff of 5 and only one of the people, which gets back to exactly what you were saying, that you have like your restorative justice person or your dean, and like the bad kids get sent to, like, bad kids, of course, is in quotes, the bad kids get sent to the dean's office, they get sent to the restorative justice room, and that person is the only person in the school, maybe a counselor, maybe a vice principal, that's building a relationship with that kid. And so that's that child's only advocate. So making sure that there's opportunities for every single person on staff to build relationship, right? And when that relationship is faltering, jumping in to help support the adult in acknowledging what they need to do to improve the relationship. Because I think that's the piece too, is that is missing a lot of times, is we want to change things that we cannot change, right? I can't change how a child responds to what I have to tell them. I can't change their response, right? What I can change is how I present it, and so I think I'm trying to consolidate what I just said. So resources, ensuring that there's real relationships with all of the members of the team, not 2 or 3 people, acknowledging when the relationships aren't there and doing what needs to happen to support it, and then reinforcing the circle of influence versus circle of concern, right? And really pushing folks to do what they can do, right, to have an impact on the child. So it creates like a spirit of curiosity rather than blaming. When a young person doesn't show up at 8 o'clock in the morning to start program, it's not, well, they don't show up, why aren't they showing up? That it becomes instead a spirit, like a curious spirit of like, okay, wait a second, why are they not showing up, right? what's happening in their life that's preventing them from showing up. Is 8 o'clock just too early in the morning? I can tell you that 8 o'clock is too early in the morning for me. Absolutely. Is there something else I can do to make this easier for them? Right. And really doing those, like emphasizing those kind of the relationship and the curiosity as like the foundation, and going back to that every single time.
Yeah. That the piece about resources though can't be understated, right? When we're talking to youth to your point about like being underpaid staff, right? Like you know, in many instances programs are paying staff what the money that's available, right? And like if they could pay more, they would. Or if they could pay more, like can we bring in another body at like this crap salary, right? Because it would like improve outcomes for students and young people. But you know, as much as we believe in abundance, we live in a world with limited resources sometimes, and the constraints of program dates or the school day like aren't necessarily conducive for us to be able to be this expansive with creative and imaginative with our with the young people and the programs that we're trying to build and execute. That's, you know, we've talked about this in a handful of different spaces, but I'm really glad that you brought it up really specifically here about like there does need to be like an investment both with time for sure, but like to make sure that there are people to give time, people who are not overworked, overburdened with a caseload or a class size or, you know, whatever word that you want to substitute in there, to actually be able to build relationships, right? Humans can't build relationships, be in good relationship with infinite amount of people, right? You can only have those kinds of relationships within the context of whatever time that you have with them. You need time to build those relationships, and if you can't have time to build that kind of deep relationship, build that rapport with infinite amounts of people. And so resources, so important.
Yeah, you know, and I have a thought about this too. I mean, I don't I wasn't writing grants when I worked in nonprofits, so I can't necessarily speak to this, but I've informed on them and I've seen budgets. And you know, and I've managed budgets. I think that so I used to be like a hobbyist dancer, right? Back in you know, a different lifetime. And one of the things that so I have a bunch of friends that are dance instructors. And so in the dance world, one of the things is not underselling yourself, right? And so there is a rate that you are supposed to charge when you are doing group classes. There is a rate you're supposed to charge when you're doing private lessons. There is a rate you're supposed to charge when you do a presentation, right? When you do an exposition and whatnot. And so when dancers uniformly agree to take less than that, it drops the value, right? And it makes it impossible for the people that are actually trying to live off of their art to be able to live off of their art, right? And this starts to couple though really well, because so much of our youth development programming relies on teaching artists, right? People who have actual art careers and are coming in once or twice a week for hopefully at least $50 or $60 an hour to do their art, right? Teach their dance class, to do their fine arts, play the violin or the drums or whatever it is that they teach, right? And so when folks get desperate or they're transitioning in and they take stuff that's less, right, it drops the value of the entire thing. And I think that sometimes nonprofits are not willing to actually name that the emperor has no clothes and make the argument that, yeah, I can do this program for $500,000 when really it needs to be 1.5 million, right? And yeah, we don't need to pay this person X amount of dollars, right? I'm not even going to name salaries because all of the salaries in youth development are offensive, right? But yeah, we can get away with paying X amount of dollars for this position. But if we dropped it 10,000 and we dropped this one 10,000, we could hire a part-time person. And so this kind of scarcity of resources, the more folks are filling out and like completing, because funders decide how much a program costs based off of the collection of budgets that they receive. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not like they just are like, oh, we've got this amount of money, you're going to do this. Right. It's like, we have this amount of money. What can you do with this? And when people overpromise and overperform, when development professionals and grant writers overpromise and overperform, it does a massive disservice to the people that are doing the work and to the young people that are receiving the services, like a massive disservice.
How do you balance that with, if we don't do our best and sacrifice everything and give all of ourselves, this will negatively impact the kids in the program now?
I don't believe that. You have to take care of yourself first. Like
I just wanted to hear you say it.
Yeah, you have to take care of yourself first. This is a big struggle. I work with a lot of adult professionals that are themselves justice involved, and they don't know how to turn off the switch. Like, they don't know how to stop, and it's not sustainable, and it's not healthy, and you're not setting a good example for the young people you're working with. The young people deserve a break too, and so it's an entire reorientation to how we see this work, and I'm old, so like the whole, like I do fall into like the millennial Gen Z like thing all the time, but God bless the young people, because they're holding us accountable. They're just like, I'm sorry, I'm on vacation right now, I'm not answering this email. And I have mad respect for that. Like, that's what's necessary, is there has to be boundaries. I don't believe in people running themselves into the ground because they're trying to save the kids, because you can't save the kids if you can't save yourself.
Just gonna let that marinate for a second for folks. I do want to name that it's not enough to yell like self-care boundaries at individuals, when we need those structures to support that as well. And so to those of you who are program staff, program managers, administrators of some sort, the moment to reflect on the conditions under which you're asking your teams to do this radical transformative work. We spent all of this time talking about in some ways, like your past career, your past life, the things that you don't do. But the reason that you and I got connected recently is because you are doing something. You've got a very tall task at hand. You are bringing, among other things, you're bringing restorative justice work into the ACLU. How did that opportunity come to you? What have you done with it? What have been the challenges? What have been the highlights? I want to hear it all.
I had my child in 2019. I planned to stay home. I already knew I was going to quit my job because it was a high performance charter school. They have no boundaries. They wrote me up when I was pregnant. Done, not going back. So I already knew I wasn't going to go back. So so I was planning to stay home for like a year, and I got offered a job at a school, and it didn't pay enough money for me to put my son in the type of childcare that I wanted. So I was like, yeah, no. And it was in the middle of the pandemic when I was offered the job too. So I was like, yeah, I don't really think I'm going to do this. So I put it off for like another 6 months, and I had no intention or like return to work date. I just kind of kept looking, and I saw this and I was like, oh, cool, ACLU. Right. And like I used to do government, like mute court stuff when I was in high school. So I've been kind of following the ACLU as an organization pretty much since I knew what politics were. And so, yeah, I applied. And honestly, I still am dumbfounded as to why I was selected for the position. It's, but yeah, I am here. And so, restorative justice is a part of like a much larger kind of DEI, what the ACLU calls EDIB, equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging work that we're doing. And really like the goal is, how do we get folks from varying different places to have the conversations that are necessary that to make the safe space, like the space safe for all of the people that are doing the work. And so yeah, I work with the 55 nationwide affiliates, and the diversity amongst the staff is just like, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. There's so many diverse, different kinds of people from so many different walks of life, and they're doing such different work. The mission of the ACLU is also really diverse. So we do we do trans advocacy. Like we're big on the map right now for a lot of the laws and the work around giving trans athletes, keeping trans athletes in sports. We're doing we're doing a lot of stuff in incarceration and decarceration work. There's a massive voting rights initiative in the South, and on some of our border states, to kind of address the onslaught on voting rights. And we also are really heavy in the restorative justice work with SB 8 in Texas. And there's just, I forget all of the other states that are kind of signing on to attacks on Roe v. Wade. The ACLU is one of the, we were on the original Roe v. Wade case. And so like and then in addition to that, we're also historically a free speech organization that has taken, and in some places still continues to take, somewhat problematic free speech. I'm not going to elaborate on that. Anyone that has Google can find it. And so there's just a lot of people, and it's a lot of different kinds of people, and they all come to the organization for different reasons. And then they get into the same space, and it seems like their priorities are conflicting when they're not. And things are said, and microaggressions are thrown, and folks are hurt, and they don't know how to have the conversation to respond to what has happened, and to respond to where the hurt has happened, and to not just have that conversation, but after that conversation has happened, have a framework to go to the next level of, what are we going to do to make this space safe, and to increase belonging for all of us, right? So that we all have a seat at the table, we're all being heard, all of us feel like we can bring maybe not our full selves, but our authentic selves to the workplace, right? How do we create the foundation to heal the harm that's already been done, and then have this conversation, on how we're going to work with each other, right? And that's kind of the work that I'm doing right now, and building out the framework for. And some of our affiliates are really, really ready for it. Some of them aren't. And it's just a lot of conversation. This beautiful work, I'm really excited about it. I get to meet so many amazing people across the country. And yeah, I'm really excited about this project.
Yeah. To give folks a little bit of context that I have, and if you went back and listened to the episode that I recorded with Amber Hikes, originally on the Diversity and Inclusion Revolution or Reform podcast feed, but it also aired here. The ACLU is a 100-year-old organization, historically white male, right? Mm-hmm. Lawyers.
Not so much male. A considerable number of our founders were female and non-binary. But yes, definitely historically white.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And over the last couple years specifically, the ACLU has grown a lot, and that growth has been very diverse. The people coming in have been from lots of different backgrounds. And so when people from different backgrounds and who have been doing work a certain way
Mhm.
come into contact with people from other backgrounds who are looking at new ways of doing things, there is a lot of space for conflict to happen, and conflict's not always a bad thing, right? Conflict can be generative, but the way that we navigate that is what's important. And I was just so excited to hear about the work that that Amber was sharing about, and that you are largely charged with helping bring to life. I'm curious, what are some of the like, yes, we did this moments that you're able to share?
Um, so part of so people are really trepidatious about this work, right? And so there's kind of two camps of folks. There's the camp of folks that like are like, yes, let's do this. I love restorative justice. They're the folks that have, have are know who Kay Pranis is, who know who Fania Davis is, right? Who have like read Adrienne Marie Brown and emergent strategy and all of that, right? So there's those people are like, yes, sign me up, I want to do this. And they're trying to like do their own circles already without having any training, which isn't necessarily problematic or wrong. I mean, we all kind of figure out ways to resolve our harm all the time, individually. And these are all skills that I think we all inherently have. We just have been taught not to use them and not to lean into them. So like there's that camp of people. And then there's a whole rest of the organization that's like, yeah, no, I'm not sure that I'm ready. We don't have safe spaces yet. We don't know how to have these conversations. I am not prepared for this. I don't know, like, I don't know if we'll ever be prepared for this, right? And so what I'm kind of like the spaces I think that have been like what I've been kind of doing to kind of coax people on board, right? I'm not trying to convince anybody because these are really vulnerable and difficult conversations. And I don't want to push anybody into a position where they would be having, engaging in anything because healing circles require disclosure. Like you have to disclose things about yourself in order for it to be successful. You have to. And so much of the harm that happens in our organization is because of invisible identities. So much. And so, yeah, like I'm just kind of trying to have as many conversations as I can. And every once in a while, someone will be like, hey, this thing happened. Can you do this? And so I'm holding these like ad hoc circles to test things out and also to give people an idea of what the experience looks like and address some of the concerns, right? And so one of the big concerns is that, oh, we're just going to talk about feelings. I'm an impacted person, right? I'm a woman of color. This person continues to microaggress me. When I tell them to stop microaggressing me, they're not doing it. I've explained to them why they don't stop. And so you just are creating another space for me to go into how I've been harmed and nothing is going to change. And they're just going to apologize and they're going to keep doing the same thing. And I'm like, okay, that is not what restorative justice is. That's not what it is. And I would not do that. And, I wouldn't set you up for that, to have that experience, right? And so just a lot of clarifying. And when folks are at that place, we're like, I think I could have this conversation, I'm facilitating those. And that I think is where the magic is starting to happen, is in those spaces where people are able to engage in ways that I don't know that they've been able to before. And also too, the ACLU is a very fast-paced organization. We talk fast, we work fast, things happen quickly, and getting people to slow down, right? So telling folks, no, I can't schedule a healing circle in 30 minutes. That's not going to happen. I'm sorry. I got to find, like, really just being clear, like this conversation is going to take time, and it may not be resolved in just one conversation. We might have to have multiple of them. And yes, you're going to have to talk to me beforehand. We're going to have the conversation, and then we're going to talk afterwards and make sure it was okay. Just so like all of the time that goes into that, I think has been really exciting. The second piece too, though, is we're doing for like preparation and that community building work. So like in the tiered triangle, the like tier 1 behaviors stuff, we're doing that. And I'm doing it with a small collection of people from across the organization right now, but also reinforcing that work in those places that are most adept and ready to kind of slow down and do all of the fun, silly, fuzzy youth development activities, with the balls of yarn and the bean bags and the pipe cleaners and the chart paper with markers and all of the turn and talks and all of that stuff that you do in youth development. I'm not just me, my entire department, we're really kind of doing what we can to support those organizations that are ready to build that culture and building that. And so we've seen a lot of just beautiful things arise in these spaces that have been created.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that in. Like, as much as it is about that repair process, that healing process, and building, it is so much more foundational to build the container where that kind of thing can happen, right? And getting people into the practice of this work is too urgent to rush, right? And in these spaces where things are so fast paced, we are fighting for justice, fighting for people's rights, and having to use the levers of the legal system to do it. Humans and our interpersonal relationships don't necessarily work that way. You can't argue someone into legally argue by past precedent, argue someone into understanding your perspective, right? You've got to create that space for storytelling and softness and gentleness to be held in those places where you've both caused harm and when you have been harmed, right? Speaking to the not throwing people away. This process that you're building, this culture that you're building within the different affiliate organizations, runs in parallel to HR processes, right? They don't overlap. Is that correct?
So this stuff that kind of logistics is some of the stuff that we're working through, because each one of our organizations is distinct and different, and so we're federated. So there's a very confusing relationship between the 55 organizations in our national office, but this is more of an influence than authority kind of conversation. So whether or not it runs in partnership with HR, parallel to HR, or entirely within HR is kind of what we're building out right now. We're not to that place yet, I don't think.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm thinking about the risks of disclosure within that. It happens within the criminal legal system. It happens within schools. It happens everywhere where circles happen. Where hey, I'm going to share this vulnerable thing in circle, and then it's going to be used against me in some other space. And because I've disclosed it to the people who hired me, who have quote unquote hierarchical authority over me, what does that mean for me? And there is no quote unquote one right way to do all these things within the context of those organizations, within those communities, within the relationships folks have. Those are important nuances to tease out, but I really appreciate you talking about how it's going to look different in every space. This isn't a blueprint and here it is, restorative justice, go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that they're those guardrails are really necessary to just because the reality is that when you start talking about microaggressions are very close to harassment, and harassment is very close to Title IX violations. So you really do have to be clear about what it is that is being discussed, and what the purpose is. But emphasizing that pre-work right, and that the pre-work is a part of and integral to and vital to restorative justice and restorative practices, I think is also really important.
Before we finish our conversation with the questions everyone answers, if you've appreciated what you've heard and wanted to learn more about restorative justice, we have so many ways to help you out. Most easily, you can join our Mighty Networks community and take our free mini course, Restorative Justice. What's that? To get a solid grounding in how we in the Amplify RJ community conceptualize this work and apply it to our lives. We also have a rotation of other live and asynchronous learning opportunities on the courses tabs of the Mighty Networks community to help you go deeper. Finally, if you want to get in touch about bringing this work to your school, community, or organization, email us at info@amplifyrj.com to make it happen. Now, back to the episode. I want to transition into the questions that everyone who comes on this podcast answers. So, in your own words, define restorative justice.
Restorative justice is the returning to the relationship to attend to and respond when we misunderstand and hurt each other.
As you've done this work, in all the contexts you've done it, what's been an oh shit moment, like a time that you messed up, or like you look back on it and it was like, what was I thinking? What was a moment like that, and what have you learned?
Probably like that little stint that I did in the charter school. There were a bunch of them. There was at least one conversation that I had where I overpromised to a young person, and I wasn't able to deliver in like the context of what they felt that they needed. And yeah, it's for there to be real repair. Like I wasn't able to deliver, and the trust I think was probably permanently like damaged because of that, and
Yeah.
yeah, and that's why this work in schools, when you have one ad hoc person, it's just like not like the ombudsman person like role, like it's too much, it's not effective.
Without getting into the specifics of this one student's situation, like how would you have promised differently?
I would have been more transparent from the beginning. Yeah. I really thought that I was going to be able to deliver what they'd asked, and I wasn't. And I should have known, and I should have been more transparent before I made promises.
We've talked about how this work has been impactful across all the professional settings that you've participated in. What has this meant? What has this way of being meant in your personal life?
Like, so first off, my worldview, like restorative justice and my experience completely informs my position as an abolitionist and my relationship to police. Completely informs like every piece of it. And I think my orientation to restorative justice and practices like provides a space where I can engage with people in law enforcement that are in my like personal life circle in ways that I don't think that I would be able to otherwise. I end up facilitating circles with kids in my life all the time, like just all the time. Like, and so it's like a fight happens and one mom is ready to grab a child, and I'm just like, no, 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 let's talk about this. What happened? I was like, in your own words, tell me what happened. And yeah, it's impressive, I think, to other people. But yeah, like I think it's definitely allowed me to pull back and
Yeah.
listen to what actually is being said and kind of respond to statements rather than assumed intentions from statements, if that makes sense.
To sit in circle with four people, living or dead. Who are they? And what is the one question you ask the circle?
I think I know my question. My question is going to be, how have you navigated life in the body that you were in? And what does that body mean to you? Um, and I have a former student whose name I'm not going to share because that would be inappropriate, but I have a former student that I would want to invite, Roberts. Dr. Dorothy Roberts, who's the author of Killing the Black Body, and she just published another book whose name I can't remember about the child welfare system. Um, let's see, Living or Dead, Frida Kahlo, and I'm gonna say my mentor from college, Dr. Robert Smith. It's a very interesting group of people, but yeah.
As best as you can, but how would you respond to it?
I'm a Black person that's not seen as being Black, and I'm also a woman. Um, and there are so many things about who I am and what I look like even things like my hair, like the number of like, oh my God, I love your hair, and having to like look at a person and try to place them someplace in the context of my historical experience to see what the motivation is behind that, right? Like, because sometimes my hair is exotic. Sometimes the love for my hair is colorism. Sometimes it's just that it's cool and it's big and people like it. You know, the way my body is sexualized in ways that are like bizarre and uncomfortable. Um, yeah, and then also like the feeling of warmth that I have when I am able to kind of move away from all of that, and I just get to like be, especially like when I get to be with my people.
What's a mantra or affirmation that you want everyone listening to this podcast to know?
Intent and impact are intricately connected, and if you can disentangle in interpretation, I think we can communicate better.
No, that's okay. But is there an example of that in your life that was like, oh yeah, that's not what I thought that person meant by that,
Oh
and
no.
now I understand?
Yeah, absolutely. It happens with me and people in my circle all the time.
Is there
Framing,
a situation?
yeah,
Yeah.
framing yourself in the conversation, I think, is important. Like I'm a light-skinned Black woman. There are
Mhm.
things that I say to people that if folks looking at me do not racialize me as Black, are the impact of my words is going to be substantially different than it is if they knew that I was raised by two Black parents. I'm frequently not racialized correctly. And so, yeah, the that interpretation is key.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Um, this one requires some homework for you, but who's one person I should have on the podcast, and you have to help me get them on.
Okay. Um, so I kind of have two people.
Yeah.
One is my cousin. Her name is Michelle Hamilton, and she is the owner of a community school, a social justice informed Montessori preschool and community school in Oakland. And they use all kinds of super restorative practices and formed. I don't know if they actually like call themselves a restorative school or not, but they do all of the work. And she's amazing. She's brilliant. She's far more intelligent than I ever thought of being. Um, and then the other is a colleague of mine named Cynthia Renta, and she manages all of the community schools here in Jersey City, which is super antiquated. And so if you can get restorative practices over here, I think it could happen pretty much
Beautiful.
anywhere.
And last question: how and where can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
I think just bringing this worldview into your life, and honestly, like I don't know that I need support, right? But because I'm not doing the work with the young people right now, right? Like I just ask that everyone that comes into contact with young people, and particularly Black and Brown young people in like what we call these quote unquote urban settings, that they approach them with kindness and love and empathy and understanding and give them spaces to be themselves. Like that would be my biggest ask, is like be there for the kids, like, and the big kids too,
Mm-hmm.
especially the big
Yeah.
kids. Give them a hug. Tell them you love them. Stop telling them to pull up their pants. Let them be. Stop talking about their skinny jeans. Like, let the children be.
Well, thank you so much, Trisa, for spending your time this afternoon sharing your stories across so many different places where this work has applied. I know that it's applicable to so many people, and so just want to extend gratitude. Any other words that you want to leave the people with?
Listen and do the work.
Beautiful. Well, we'll be back with another person living this restorative justice life next week. Until then, take care.
Thank you, Trisa. There's so much that I can pull from this episode, but one of the first things that really came to mind was when Trisa was talking about her educational experiences, and she mentioned, how can we encourage people to show up in the ways that they are available? Not always the ways that we need them to be, but how can we reach out to them in the ways that they are available? And I think that's a really important distinction that we don't always make. Similarly, towards the end, Trisa offered her mantra affirmation idea was the idea of impact versus intent, and how that we also have to honor the impact of our actions despite our intent. So I want to pose the question, how can we honor the thoughts and needs of others while still making space for our own needs? I think that this episode really touched on a lot of different and important ways to prioritize the needs of others while also taking care of yourself. If you'd like to stay connected to Trisa and learn a lot more, make sure to check out her socials down below in the show notes, and also check out Amplify Restorative Justice on Mighty Networks and Instagram, where we post a lot of new content every single week. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes, or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.